So today we're going to talk about root vegetables. There's a whole selection of root vegetables, but I think what's important for us to understand is that these roots are a storage unit that stores energy for the greater good of the plant. So as an example, here is a celery root. And as it grows, extra energy from the roots and from photosynthesis gets stored here in the root, and it can draw upon that during lean times, or it can draw upon that even after the vegetable is harvested. Now, if these roots can store energy and nutrition for the plant, they can do exactly the same for us. And I think that's the appeal of root vegetables for all of us. They're also tremendously versatile. You can fry them, you can boil them, you can roast them, and I'll try and show you a lot of those different techniques today. One thing I want to point out is that a lot of these vegetables, especially the larger ones, no longer have their tops attached. So as an example, here's a parsnip, and it's had its top taken off. The larger carrots have the tops taken off. Here, on the other hand, are some carrots that were just pulled out of the garden half an hour ago. You can see the dirt still on the bottom, but the tops are in great, great condition. If the tops are attached, you can use them as an indication of quality and condition. How can I imagine the flavor and the texture of these vegetables based on the quality and the condition of the tops? If they're nice and fresh like this, I would assume that the vegetable itself is fresh. If, on the other hand, I get something that looks like this, I might pause for a second and say, wait a second, what's going on? These tops have already begun to take the nutrition, the moisture and the sugars from the root, and you can see how they're starting to soften and wrinkle. I wouldn't buy that. I wouldn't go out of my way. In fact, I'm just going to take that and we'll throw that right into the garbage. Now, sometimes when you buy them and the tops are in great shape, at the supermarket they'll say, do you want to use the tops? And oftentimes I say, yes, I would love them. But they will even go out of their way to break these and then sell you the whole thing. But just by breaking the stem, no longer will the tops draw nutrition from the root itself. So let me take this and set it aside. Here is a celery root, as I said before, and I can only imagine they leave the tops on because people don't really recognize celery root for what it is. But when I get it in, I oftentimes come in and I take the tops off and discard them because I know that if I don't, this is what's going to start to happen. It'll get soft. The root itself will begin to soften. So getting rid of this is not a bad idea. If you take a look at this turnip right here, you can see that the tops that have been cut off are just starting to sprout again. Here's something, a turnip that's pretty large. Who knows if it'll ever get used here, but you can sort of understand a little bit more about root vegetables and their function in a plant. Okay, so we'll set this all aside. We'll clean things up. So, what are we going to make? I'm going to make something called tapenade. Tapenade takes its name from capers. But typically it's black olives, capers, anchovies, all big flavors that will make these vegetables taste great. So let's get started here. I'm going to make this right on the board. I'm going to chop it right here on the board. First thing I'm going to do is take a clove of garlic, and we'll begin the process by chopping that up. I'm going to do a lot of chopping here, so let's just start like that. And then anchovies. Now, anchovies, maybe 2 or 3 will make their way in here. This will lend a nice savory, salty flavor to what I'm preparing. Always keep in mind, you're trying to build flavor for basically raw vegetables. this is going to have to carry the day for a big plate of raw vegetables. So anchovies go on. I'm also going to add some capers. And as I said, all tapenade will have capers in it. There's two different variations right here. You may see this on the market. This is a salted caper. And they have a great flavor, but if you find them, you have to rinse the salt off and then soak them for about a half an hour or so, changing the water once or twice. Otherwise, you can just buy capers that come in a jar and they're in brine. So let's take some capers. We'll add that. You get a nice briny, salty, vegetal flavor from the capers. And then olives. Now, I've got black olives right here. Kalamata olives or any number of other olives that are black would work. Niçoise olives as an example. What I wouldn't do is buy the can of Lindsay olives. Those really don't carry much flavor with them. So you want a full flavored olive, and those are going to go right here. And let's get started doing a little chopping. Now, I'm doing it on the cutting board at home. You might decide that it's worth pulling out the food processor. That works as well. If you're really old school, you might pull out a mortar and pestle and pound these things together. But the result that you're looking for remains exactly the same. You want this to be reduced to sort of a coarse puree. I'm going to flavor this a little bit more. I'm going to put some orange zest on here, just to give it a little bit of citrusy, aromatic punch. All the while, I'm imagining eating these vegetables over here. Sweet, but you know, a little bit of orange flavor might not be the worst thing in the world. And I'm going to add also some lemon zest, make it a little sharp, and again, aromatic. All right. And back to the chop-a-thon. If you do it by knife, it's kind of a fun, almost meditative experience, but I'll offer this warning. Take advantage of the nice curve of the knife to chop up and down. And over here, make sure that all your fingers are on top of the blade so you know where they're at all times. Sooner or later you get tired, and if this finger is up in the air when you start, it may end up on the cutting board, and then you've got a problem. And transfer this over to a bowl, because even though I can guarantee you there's a lot of flavor in here, this is still not really the dip that I'm looking for. This is sort of the flavor base for that preparation. So, next steps. I'm going to add a little bit of olive oil to this, moisten it up. I'm going to take a little squeeze of lemon juice. We'll put a pinch of pepper in here. Probably doesn't need salt because the olives and the anchovies and the capers are pretty salty already. And then to move this forward into a dip, let's put in just a little bit of Dijon mustard. That'll give it a nice spiciness. And some mayonnaise. This is just commercial mayonnaise. Here is a little bit of basil, and I'm going to bring it over. Let me just share a quick thought about basil with you. We're going to add basil to this, but you run into a problem if you chop basil. Basil is one of a couple of different herbs that will turn black when you chop it. There's enzymes that when they're exposed to air turn black. And so I didn't put it in early on purposely. I didn't want to chop it up and have it turn black. Instead, I'm going to take this and roll it into a little cigar, if you will. And then we're going to cut straight across into what's known as a chiffonade. You hear in there the word chiffon, so kind of light And this is the way of cutting it into small pieces without it turning black. I'll give it one or two more cuts, and then that's going to make its way into the finished dish. Okay. And what I have here for vegetables is baby carrots. I've got a couple of different colors of baby carrots, some almost white, some orange, and some like this right here that are almost purple. What's really interesting is that all carrots started out this way, early on. The orange carrot that we all know and love is a relatively recent phenomenon. They were bred to take on this new and different color. But you'll find still heirloom varieties that have white coloration or almost purple like that. I've got some turnips, some radishes, all different kinds of root vegetables, all babies. And you can see a beautiful selection of vegetables with a really savory, full-flavored dip. Crudité with a tapenade-based dip. So I showed you one of my favorite snacks, the crudité with the tapenade mayo. I'm going to show you another right now. I think of this as great bar food, so if you like to drink a beer, this is what you want to have with it. We're going to take parsnips, and we're going to slice them very thin and fry them almost like they were potatoes. Now, there's a challenge that you're facing. One of them is how to slice it thin, and this is my choice of the tool right here. I've got a peeled parsnip. I'm going to cut the end off, so there's no stem end left, and then just very, very carefully run it down what the French call a mandolin. This is a Japanese mandolin, but it takes its name from this idea that it looks a little bit like playing the mandolin as you go. So I have some parsnips that are all sliced right here, and we're going to fry them. I've got a pot of oil that's going. One thing you need to realize is that because these have that wonderful, sweet, sort of anisey flavor, very different from a carrot, that sweetness can get you into trouble because it browns too quickly. So what I'm going to do is put them into oil, but not at the same temperature I might fry potatoes, 350 degrees, but instead closer to 275 or 300 degrees, something like that. I'll put them all in and turn the temperature down just a hair. So when you're frying, you want to make sure that the oil in the pot doesn't come much beyond halfway up the side of the pot. Otherwise, when you add moist food and it begins to bubble and seethe, you run the risk of it sort of spilling over the top. Now, if you have an open flame and then the oil catches fire, that could be an issue. But any little fire is easy to take care of. You just move the pot away, you turn the ignition source off, and everything's right with the world. So as you can see in the pot here, these are bubbling away nicely. I like to tell students that it's almost as if the instructions are built in. The bubbling that you see is water boiling. So the water in the vegetables is boiling. And as long as I see that bubbling, I know that there's a lot of water still in the vegetables, and that if I were to take them out of the oil, they would be soggy and soft and limp. If, however, I continue to cook them until the bubbling subsides, that tells me that the water is out. And if they begin to brown after that point, then I know they'll be golden brown, but also crisp when they cool. I would say it's going to take somewhere between 8 and 10 minutes to fry. So we'll check up on them in just a second. You may notice that some of these begin to brown a little bit earlier than others. And if that's the case, you can just pluck them out and set them aside. What would make them brown unevenly is simply cutting them unevenly. So just take your time when you're cutting these so that you're sure that they're even. Now, as they're coming out of the oil, make sure you turn the oil off. That's not something you want to forget on the stove. So I just turned the oil off, all out. And while they're still a little bit wet with the oil, go ahead and season them pretty generously with salt. And then there's a little garniture that I like for something like this. You remember we had some carrot tops earlier. I'm going to take those and just throw them right in. Now, there's a lot of moisture in here, so just make sure that might sputter a little bit. And we're going to fry those until they're nice and crispy. They're going to turn a nice, deep, dark color. And as before, I'm looking for the bubbling to subside. That tells me that all the water is out of them. All right. So here we go. These are nice and crisp. I'm going to sprinkle on a little bit of Parmesan cheese. I'm also going to sprinkle on some chopped parsley, not just on the top, but all the way through. The cheese I can see already beginning to melt on the warm chips. And then we'll add those as well. Some pepper. And that's all there is to that. As I said, with a beer and a plate of fried parsnips, I'm good to go. So I'm going to take another root, the celery root, and I'm going to do something sort of fun with it. I'm going to make a cutlet from it. So in Japan, they have a dish called tonkatsu, which is a pork cutlet that's breaded and fried. We're going to do the same with celery root. Let me just show you quickly how to peel a celery root, because it's a little bit tricky. I'm going to cut the stem off. We'll discard that. And then you don't want to use a vegetable peeler as much as you do a knife. You're going to come in here and use your knife to sort of peel around the outside and take this tough rind or this hide off the outside. Already I can smell sort of this sweet celery aroma. And the next step is already done for us, but if we cut this into cutlets, if you will, about 1/4 of an inch thick, and we cook them in boiling salted water, you end up with something that looks very much like this. You want them to be tender all the way through, so if I pierce it with a knife, the knife goes in easily, but it comes out just as easily. We'll set those aside, and the next step is to bread those. So let me show you what a standard breading setup looks like. Let me move this aside. The first stop when you're breading is flour. The second stop is beaten egg, and the third stop is breadcrumbs. And a shallow container like this is a nice idea. When you get to breading, it's a good idea to recognize that you want to keep one of your hands for dry ingredients and one of your hands for wet ingredients. If you go back and forth, very, very quickly what you discover is you've breaded your own hands, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger, covered with egg and flour and breadcrumbs. So one hand for dry, one hand for wet. Okay, we're going to hook these back together. I like to make a point of seasoning the flour with salt and pepper so that it's not robbing flavor from my finished preparation. And we'll just stir that in. And then we go first into flour, and pat all the excess off. That's kind of important. This is now my dry hand. And I go into the egg and turn that and make sure that it's uniformly covered. And then we let the excess drip off into the breadcrumbs. And again, with my dry hand, I turn this once or twice and pat the breadcrumbs on. There's one. Okay, I think the oil is hot enough now. So I'm going to take each of these cutlets. When you put it into the oil, it's a good idea to lay it in away from yourself. So if it does splash, it splashes on something that's not you. So here we go. In it goes. Number 2, in it goes. Number 3, in it goes. Basically what I'm doing here is pan frying. So I'm not deep frying. I don't have a lot of fat there, just enough to come about halfway up the side of what it is that I'm frying. All right. While that's frying, and I'm going to turn the temperature down just a hair, we're going to make a quick sauce to go with this. It's very, very simple. Let me bring the ingredients up here and you can see them. I'm going to add some ketchup. Everybody has that in their fridge, likely. I'm going to add just about the same amount of soy sauce. I'm going to flavor it with Worcestershire sauce. Some mustard. It can be spicy mustard if that's the way you like it. A pinch of allspice. And then finally, we're going to season it with some sugar. I'm going to present it in a little pot, just like this. I think that's a nice idea. It doesn't have to be a hot sauce. It doesn't have to be heated. Let's see how we're doing here. There's some nice color. Beautiful. At this point, when you're pan frying, recognize that you put cold food in, it takes a while for the pan to recover. But once it's recovered, once it's starting to brown, you can turn the heat down and you'll be able to maintain the appropriate temperature. All right, so there's one other component. We've got this delicious sauce, but I want to make a little salad. So I've got some nice Napa cabbage right here, and the dressing couldn't be simpler. Salt, pepper, and just a little bit of red wine vinegar. Doesn't take very much. All right. Here's what the cabbage or the celery root looked like when it was raw. And here are 1, 2, 3 beautiful little celery root cutlets. I've got a little rice as well. And let's start with 1, 2, we'll add some rice to the plate. And then finally some of this cabbage salad. I'm going to put a little bit, right down the border here. And then the balance of the sauce we can serve on the side. So there you have it. Celery root tonkatsu with a very simple cabbage salad. Try this, and I don't think you'll ever miss the fact that it's not made with a pork cutlet. So everybody's healthiest dessert option is always carrot cake. But even at that, it's not really a healthy dessert. So I set myself the task of making carrot cake even a little bit healthier. I'm going to include more vegetables. I'm going to get rid of some of the saturated fat. Don't think of this as a healthy dessert, but it's a delicious dessert. So here we go. I'm going to start by taking some parsnips, and the parsnips I'm going to add as well as carrots. I'm going to cook them so they're a puree, and I'm going to cook them in a small amount of water. Why? Because I don't want to pour the water off and send all the flavor down the drain. I want it to stay in the pan. So a small amount of water with a lid on, and cook them until they're tender. Parsnips have sort of an anisey flavor and a real sweetness. That sweetness is only brought out more by cooking them because the cell structure begins to break down and the natural sugars become available. So I've done that here. I've cooked these parsnips, and here what you'll see is a parsnip puree. Okay, so parsnip puree and carrots are both going into this cake, and I think we'll get more complexity. Let's get started. So I'm going to begin by adding some eggs to this bowl, and we'll whip them. In addition to the eggs, I'm going to add some vanilla extract. So a pinch of salt. And then finally, I'm going to whisk in some vegetable oil. This is canola oil. So I'm going to whisk this for about 2 to 3 minutes. What you'll notice is it gets progressively thicker and thicker. Okay, I'm happy with that. Let me walk you through the dry ingredients very quickly. Most carrot cakes start with a white flour, like an all-purpose flour, and I have some of that here, but I'm going to introduce some whole wheat flour as well so we get more fiber and nutrition. So in goes the whole wheat flour. And then in terms of spices, we'll add ginger, we'll add cinnamon, a pinch of the allspice, and then the baking powder goes in as well. Now, obviously you're going to measure these things with tablespoons, but I'm pretty familiar with this recipe and feel confident that we're on the right track there. There's really no need to sift all these together, but if you have a sifter, you can use it. I'm just going to stir it with a whisk to make sure it's homogeneous. And then I've got sugar here as well, and the sugar can get added right into the dry ingredients. All right. And I'm going to add the carrots. I'm going to add the puree of parsnip, which not only adds flavor, but it'll keep this cake nice and moist for a long time. And then some crushed pineapple. So those can all get stirred in. That looks good. And now we're going to introduce all the dry ingredients as well. And I'm going to add them all at once. And again, we'll fold this together, down in the middle, up on the outside, fold it over, fold it over. It's a fairly thick batter, but don't let that concern you. I'm going to set that aside for a second. And here I have a half sheet pan. I've put a piece of parchment paper on the bottom, and I've oiled the outside so that nothing will stick. But just take this and spread it to the 4 corners of the pan. Keep in mind this will be about twice as thick when it finally is done baking. All right. And that's why I like baking. Let's go ahead and put this in the oven. 375 degrees, about 20 minutes. So while our cake is cooling, we need to make some frosting. And I wanted to make some changes also. I wanted to make some changes to that frosting. I took a look at this parsnip puree, and I have it right here. And you look at it, and its consistency and even its flavor is almost like frosting in its own right. So that sort of inspired me. What I want to do is say, what would happen if we got rid of about a third of the cream cheese? Let's just get rid of that. Let's set it aside. Let's take about a quarter of the butter, and let's get rid of that as well. And then we'll make our frosting and replace what we've taken out with parsnip puree. Okay, so this goes into the mixer. Likewise, the butter goes into the mixer. And we'll begin the process of beating that. So we're going to beat this butter and cream cheese just for a couple of minutes until it begins to get smooth and creamy. Okay, this is nice and creamy right now. I'm going to take the bowl out for just a second and just scrape the sides of the bowl to make sure that nothing has stuck to the bowl and it hasn't been scraped away by the paddle. Now, this is a measured amount of powdered sugar. This is typically what would go in here, but I'm a little concerned, and my concern is this, that the parsnips are sweet in their own right. So I'm going to leave about a quarter of this powdered sugar behind. There. Maybe a little bit more, and we'll set that aside. And back into the mixer. And let's take it to the next step. Now, oftentimes, sour cream is added to this. And what it does is it lends a little bit of tang, but it also thins it out so that it spreads a little bit more smoothly. I'm not going to add any sour cream at all. I'm going to put this over here with the sugar, the butter, the cream cheese, and we're going to give it a little bit of tang with a splash of lemon juice. And we're going to begin to introduce parsnip puree. Now, the one caution I would throw your way, we don't want so much that it begins to get very loose. And we can set the frosting aside. Okay, look what we have left behind. I don't know how to figure out the number of calories here, but easily, half a cup of sugar, about a third of a cup of sour cream, and here, easily 4 ounces of butter and cream cheese mixed. All of those things we're not going to add. Okay, let's take a look at our cake. Here it is. You can see it's risen. It's nicely golden brown. It has separated all the way around the edge. That's a good sign. And what I'm going to do is turn it out onto another pan so that we can see the bottom side. Hoop. I can see that it's nice and moist. And we've got parsnips and carrots to thank for that, along with the oil. What I want to do is trim off the edges. Those are snacks for me. Those are snacks for my daughter. And let's trim the long edges as well. And what I want to do is cut this into 3 pieces. Let's begin with 1 piece of cake on our platter and some of this frosting. Now, if you decide that it's a little bit too soft, it's an easy thing just to pop it into the refrigerator for a second, or maybe more than a second. And we'll just spread this close to the edges. And then Second piece goes on. And, we'll just press it into place. Let the icing spread to the edges. So let's finish this up. On the top, I like to add some toasted walnuts. I'm going to add some dried fruit. We'll put some apricots around the edge, and I've got some dried cherries, and I've got some golden raisins. And then let's put some large pieces of walnut, toasted walnuts around as well. And then just so we don't forget where we came from. Remember, this was parsnips. I saved some of the carrot tops from earlier, and let's just take them and tuck them all around the edge of our cake. And when somebody asks us what they are, you can sort of tell them with a little bit of pride that this is a carrot cake made with fresh carrots. The tops are proof of that, and that you included parsnips and toasted walnuts as well. These carrot tops are here to tell a story about all the hard work you did in the kitchen trying to change this recipe so that while it's a delicious dessert, it also is well on its way to being a little healthier. As you will see across all the lessons in this course, the humble root vegetable, whether we're talking about parsnips or carrots, rutabaga or horseradish, is really a treasure. It's readily available, it's inexpensive, it's tremendously versatile, and it's really tasty.